Now it is time once again, as we like to when we complete any of these novels, to speak to the author. We are joined by the author of Reaper's Gale, Steven Erikson. Welcome back to the show, Steven. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And as I mentioned, before we started recording, I look forward to these sessions.
So do we. It is what a treat to be able to be blown away by these books and then speak to the author every time. And I just feel like I'm so tickled to be able to have that opportunity. And we have so many questions for you. The Discord had a bunch of questions for you this time. But overall, I think you heard Lana and I just absolutely loved Reaper's Gale.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard at this point for me to even rank the novels. Not that we even need to rank the novels, but do you have an internal rank, or is it like ranking children for you?
That's tough. Okay, this is it's an answer I've given before. So I'm sort of just repeating myself here, but and I don't know if it's still true, so I'll just say it anyways. Um, I think Deadhouse Gates felt the tightest of the books. Um, and Midnight Tides was the one that was the most effortless to write.
Hmm.
So, curiously, in a lot of ways, Reaper's Gale is a sequel to Midnight Tides. Um, and by this point, all of the environmental settings are in place, and things have been pulled together. And so I know you mentioned that there was a sense of almost completion when you finished this book, and
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons for that is that you're now about to shift locations fairly dramatically. Um, but don't worry, it's back to a place that you've been to before. So it's kind of revisiting something. Um, so I guess there was a sense that where we would stop at the end of Reaper's Gale, you'd be okay with taking like a one novel break from picking that story up again. And that's kind of how it's set up right now. So,
Well, we're super excited to jump into Toll the Hounds. Lana, have you started reading it? I have not.
I have not started. I mean, you know
Yeah.
me. I can't. I don't know what it is, but my ability to retain information. I'm like just a colander of a brain, so I gotta always sort of put it further out there. But it's interesting. I mean, we got the vibe of this being like the continuation of the sequel to Midnight Tides. I mean, we're in Letheras, we're seeing a bunch of familiar characters, but something that is interesting, I think, about both this book and Midnight Tides. This did feel like a big ending, but instead of it necessarily being like one massive bombastic ending, it felt like so many little knots being tied. And I felt that way similarly to Midnight Tides, where there was sort of more disparate groups that were sort of following. Was this an intentional sort of feature of these stories centered on Letheras, these sort of more political intrigue kind of stories that both of those books had that distinct approach to them?
that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, the we last time or when we spoke about Midnight Tides, I mean, I sort of gave the impetus for why I was inspired to write that particular story. But of course, that's only Midnight Tides is only the first half of that. It's what follows. What are the consequences of that conquest? And that's where, I kind of concluded that the system that was going to be so-called conquered was going to in turn conquer the conquerors.
Mm.
And so I need to get back to that point so I could play that out, and the reader could see, I guess, sort of the conclusions I was drawing or setting up, at least in Midnight Tides.
That was directly leads to one of my major questions. This notion of the conquered people retaining more power than the conquerors.
Mhm.
Is that something that you saw in history that you were inspired by, or that just felt like natural for this
No,
fantasy
it was,
setting?
yeah, it was more part of the, well, maybe, yeah, I could draw some elements of history from that. Um, but it was more the thought experiment of, if um, the Lakota and the other tribes of in the Sioux Wars, I think is the terminology for it. If they uh, had the ability to defeat the U.S. cavalry and march on Washington and occupy it and basically take over the country, what would actually happen after that? Would sort of the cultural traits and belief systems and political structures and all the rest of the Lakota actually replace that broader American system? And I mean, by that point, that American system was also a global system because that's what it arose from. Emerged from the British Empire. So uh, the thought experiment was basically that that system was simply too powerful and too pervasive, and it would eventually sort of take over the uh, sort of the political cap that was sitting on top of all things. So I suppose historically, you could look at the Normans when they conquered England. They were there for and imposed their presence, brought their laws and their social structures and all the rest. But that did not ultimately result in the UK speaking French, for example,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
it was just a case of my sense of just that the system itself being too powerful and too pervasive. And so that sort of led me to the idea that the only way to take that thing down is from the inside. And that's
Yeah.
where the role of Tehol and Bug sort of
Now,
came to the fore.
and was that part of your conception as you were writing Midnight Tides, or did you write Midnight Tides and then think, okay, well, what is the logical progression from where I've left this?
No, no. I'd worked that up even before I started Midnight Tides because everything in Midnight Tides has to be in place and setting up Reaper's Gale,
Right.
right? So
Right.
I needed to make sure everything was, all the ducks were in a row, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So when it comes to sort of looking ahead, I felt like this book, I mean, Jeff and I have talked about it so much on the show. You seem to be no stranger for subverting our expectations. And that
Hmm.
is from like the most evilest of the evil, having this sympathetic that you are able to build empathy for them at the last minute, even through all the things that you've witnessed. And I feel like this book was filled with curveballs, all of the
Hmm.
dragons sort of uh, sinister desire, or I wouldn't even say sinister, their desires, what they want, Menendora,
Hmm.
Silchus, Trolls, lonely demise, Karsa and Akarium, this building of energy. Are they going to fight? What's the deal? Can you talk, like, were all of those curveballs part of that sort of, that you're going to tee this up to sort of, you, or can you talk more about the motivation for building up all that energy to sort of disperse it in a way that felt like almost cavalier?
Hmm. Um, well, I've had a sense that in writing this series, I wanted to make sure that each novel could stand on its own merits, so that it wasn't to be continued
Mhm.
at the end of the books. So, because I wanted a sense of the reader getting at least the satisfaction of that sort of wrapped up, um, not fully wrapped up, but sufficiently wrapped up plot lines. Um,
Honestly, not to interject, but I think that's one of the most extraordinary things about the Malazan Book of the Fallen as a series for me is that you're managed to do that every time, so far at least, and that I
yeah.
feel like each book does have this crescendo ending that is satisfying and is thrilling and doesn't feel like a to be continued, and yet I still am drawn into the next novel.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing to be able to pull off with 10 books.
Well, it's I guess it's partly my taste as a reader. Um, I like that sense of completion when I finish reading a book.
Mm.
And I mean, another good example would be Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time series. And each one is very much a standalone novel, but it's also a continuation or an elaboration on some of the things he began in the first book. So, yeah, I always sort of, as a reader, that kind of appealed to me. And the other thing, of course, was as a longtime reader of fantasy, I knew that uh, it's very challenging to surprise the reader because there is a kind of it's not a set plot line series sense, but it's almost as if the concluding scenes of many fantasy novels, there can be an element of sameness to them. Where the Dark Lord is defeated and the
Yeah.
heroes arise.
We've
And
thrown the ring into the volcano.
yeah, and the status quo is reestablished to the
Mm-hmm.
comfort of everyone. So that was the challenge that I sort of wanted to try to tackle, was to surprise the reader repeatedly. So the best way of doing it is to set up the expectations so that the reader feels that they are able to predict where it's going, and then to pull the rug out from under them as best I can.
So does that feel intimidating in any way to tackle for you, of being like, okay, I'm building up XYZ huge moments, and then I'm gonna, for lack of a better word, sort of rug pull at the last minute,
Hmm.
but knowing that there's like, how do you know? Not even how do you know, but is it intimidating even knowing that there's still so much in the book and so much about the ending that will leave the reader satisfied? Because I think that is a tricky balance of, I want to surprise you with this ending, but not have it be such a left turn that you're like, what in the heck is,
Mm.
like, how
Unsatisfying.
have
Yeah.
you developed that sense, or
I
is it
have,
always a risk?
yeah, I have no idea. No, there's no way to predict. You set things up in the hopes that you're leading the reader to the place you want to lead them to. And that's not just in terms of plot lines and that kind of thing, but like you say, you need a sense of satisfaction as a reader, and um, and that's always hugely challenging. Um, I know that for a lot of people in Midnight Tides, the whole Red Mask storyline is just, it's an outlier for them,
Mm-hmm.
and they struggle with trying to work out what's all that about. Um, so that may be one instance where I did not succeed in leading to that element of satisfaction. Mind you, I mean, the conclusion of that one, which, like you said in your discussions, is a bit coming from left field, right? The two Kell hunters just, run up parallel to Red Mask and take him down. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I knew it was a risk. I knew what I was doing there, but there's no guarantee that the reader is satisfied with that.
So can you talk? I mean, it's like you're looking at my notes, because that was exactly my next question was Red Mask. Because I think, to elaborate on what you're talking about, he is built up like this supreme badass who is unstoppable and is just going to, have his, exert his will on the battlefield. And then, of course, things start going wrong, and we
Hmm.
have talk saying, this guy's not that smart. And ultimately his two Kell hunters agree very vehemently.
Yeah.
So can you speak about like what for you was the message to take away from that? Was it a comment on overconfidence, or war in general,
No,
or what? Yeah, what was
no,
it?
no. Okay, well, consider the context of that original impetus for me to write Midnight Tides, um, where I was thinking about um, the colonial expansion of Europeans into North America and elsewhere, but primarily for my inspiration, it was North America. If we think in historical terms, um, the European style expansion into the West, how the West was won, I think was that classic film on that one. Um, there's an element of um, I don't know if I call it propaganda, myth making. There's an element of myth making to that. Um, but if you look at it historically, there were plenty of voices coming from the colonized cities on the East Coast, especially philosophers and thinkers and historians who were decrying the fate of the native nations in that expansion west. So even though there was a political determination that's built this mythology of manifest destiny that led outwards, there were plenty of journalists and I guess quasi-ethnologists who were just saying, this is horrendous. So if you think of that context, then one way to look at Red Mask is as effectively Gray Owl, and that was kind of the storyline I was thinking of is somebody from the conquering culture um, doing the effect of going native, as it were, um, and then attempting to fight on behalf uh, of
He,
those people. So that
he's
there's
your
a
Dances with Wolves.
well, yeah, there's a grand deception that is
Yeah.
occurring throughout that.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess maybe the conclusion was that, I mean, the sensibilities um, of Red Mask could not be consistent with the cultural sensibilities of the culture that he was pretending to be part of, and that there was always going to be a mismatch there. And so that's kind of what I was trying to explore.
Mm.
Um, and then, of course, by the time you get to the end, I had this. I knew where the final battle was occurring, and the thing I really wanted to sort of lay out there was when everybody's covered in mud, you can't tell who is who,
Hmm.
and so it becomes a sameness, in a sense that everybody is reduced simply to their human state, as it were,
Mm.
and uniforms and flags and colors almost lose relevance once the violence has reached that stage. So that was kind of thematically what I was trying to, bring across.
So his whole endeavor was doomed to fail.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I love that.
So we've got a bunch of wonderful questions from our
Hmm.
Discord. I'm going to sort of sporadically bring them in as they're sort of thematically relevant. You've talked already a bit about this, but Sidarosaurus was very curious about Red Mask, where they've listened to previous interviews with you where you've spoken about his function in the story and his thematic significance in the plot line, but he's still really curious about the guy himself as a person and what might have been going on inside his head the whole time. Would you be able to speculate a little further on Red Mask as like going into that final battle? Did he realize that he was doomed to fail, and so
No,
he set it
no.
up spectacularly? There's had this ultimate confidence and it just wasn't
Yeah,
the way that it was.
yeah. It didn't play out the way he hoped for. Um, but I mean, the things that was pushing him into this state was sort of a kind of exaggerated white man's burden. Um, and so, he's carrying the guilt of what his culture has done to the all people. and that is overwhelming, even his tactical sensibilities and all
Hmm.
the rest. So that's more or less what I had in mind when I was exploring that.
You talked a little bit about the myth making element, which I think is so profound. And one of the things that Lana and I both commented on with Tehol's sort of ascension to becoming this beloved revolutionary and eventually even the emperor, the new emperor, is that was seeded, purchased essentially by the Ratcatchers Guild, right? That wasn't this natural progression of the people just seeing how noble his intentions were. That was literally,
Hmm.
myth making on the grandest or on the most deliberate scale. And
Transactional.
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And it occurs to me that I think another author might instead just sort of imagine that the people saw what the reader is seeing, which is that, Tejal's a good guy and his intentions are good and we like him. And so all the people see that as well. But, it rings so much truer the way you show it to be this, this intentional, manipulated thing. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that at all, that decision to play it out that way.
Well, yeah, it would have struck me as unlikely or even false
Yeah.
to have the people sort of suddenly jump behind this character whom very few people knew about, anyways. I mean, he was just sort of that comical character that glimpsed every now and then on the roof of a particular
Right.
building,
Wearing a towel.
with few clothes on. So it wouldn't have made any sense. I mean, what the reader knows in terms of the machinations between Tehol and all his cohorts and Bug and rest is way beyond what the general population would know. So it wouldn't make sense for them to just spontaneously throw their allegiance against somebody of whom they know nothing.
Right.
And so I realized at that point that no, this has to be entirely manufactured, because that's kind of how these things happen. So
Yeah.
I loved the whole part of it with Letheras because there is this fascinating part about that city where when we're introduced to it in Midnight Tides, it's like, oh yeah, this capitalism, baby. They care about gold. That's it. It's literally gold. You're drowning with it. You're hungering after it. You're indebted with it. It's the society. But elsewhere in the world, we haven't really seen talk about money. There
mhm.
are, transactional, things that are happening, but it hasn't necessarily been overtly about the cold hard cash, where even with Letheras turning to dust around the people from a Karm's machine and the riots that are happening, still at the end, the thing that prevails and pulls people through is somebody in the back being like, yeah, say Tehol is dope, and handing somebody out $100. Is the fact that that financial thread prevailed in Letheras, I found to be like a very interesting thing where even in the rest of this world as we've seen it, it doesn't matter, but it's
Right,
all
right.
that matters.
Yeah, but that's the whole point of taking it down from within, in a sense.
Yeah.
You use the mechanisms that culture values and
Mhm.
identifies. If you try to impose external mechanisms, it fails.
Mhm.
Historically, it fails every time. So, um, yeah, it made perfect sense that it would have to use all the things that are already in place, because that's not too great a step for the citizenry, because they get it, because they grew up in this system. So that's sort of the idea there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as we rapidly tumble toward oligarchy here in the United States, it's hard not to draw parallels to Letheras and this. One wonders if the ultimate change that we need isn't going to have to come in a similarly disruptive fashion. I don't know. I don't need you to comment on that if you don't want to, but I can't help but read these novels and think they're prescient and applicable to our turbulent times.
Yeah. I mean, all civilizations are cyclical. So, but I think that conceit has always been there. And the conceit I mean is the conceit that our particular civilization at this particular point in time is the exception to the rule. I've probably told this story before, but in the early 80s, when I was traveling through Guatemala, I remember standing on a reconstructed pyramid in the Petén. I think it could have been Tikal, the big site there. And I was standing where, basically the high priest would have stood 1,000 years earlier. And that high priest would have looked out and would have seen nothing but farmland. Nice canal systems, you name it, but farmland, right out to the horizons. And I don't doubt for a minute that priest believed that this was going to last forever, that this was eternal. And there I was standing there, and all I could see in front of me was just jungle, just forest. And I remember thinking at the time, it felt very poignant to me because it reminded me of just how ephemeral civilization can be, and it doesn't take much. I think it was probably 50 years of drought was sufficient to take this entire thing down. And what's interesting is you had in the Mayan civilization, you had cities popping up and sinking down and then popping up somewhere else. And so as the civilization, it persisted. But as a local manifestation, it seemed to have had a relatively short time period in which the environment could be around that city could be exploited to its max, and then it would just that was it. It was gone. And so, at least for me, I'm left thinking, okay, well, what was that? What was that like in those last few years of the heyday or the twilight of the city of Tikal or any of the others? And from the looks of it, this was not, everybody suddenly dying off. This was not a case of kind of a sudden dramatic end. It seemed to be more as if the average person lost faith in the structure of the government. And it was a theocracy. And they simply walked away. Especially since the theocracy was very much tied into rituals and sacrifices for the sole purpose primarily of bringing the rains back. So it's tied into the fertility of the region and controlling the weather and calling upon the gods to bring the rain so that you could plant your corn and all the rest. And when that bargain started to fail, I don't know if you've seen Apocalypto.
Yeah.
Mel Gibson. It's an extraordinary film, and that shows sort of the cultural madness that can afflict a civilization that's teetering on the edge of collapse. And I suspect there was some of that going on for sure. I think we do have some indications that the rates of sacrifice, human sacrifice, just skyrocketed, towards the end of these periods. So clearly, the high priest or the priesthood was dealing with a certain amount of desperation in what they were attempting to do. And their belief system may well have been that if we sacrifice enough people, the rains will come.
Yeah, just one more, one
more.
more.
Or it may have been the case of we need to do this in order to maintain an element of control over the population through fear.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's probably both, right?
Yeah.
So there's a secular element, and then there may be a faith-based one as well. So I guess, yeah, that's to me that sense of just how fragile civilization can be. Really hit home. And that's always haunted me. So, when I finally start writing these books, I'm always thinking in those terms as well. That was a long, probably. Uh, that's an answer that probably didn't answer the question.
No, it was
It was
fascinating though.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, speaking of sacrifice and things be feeling temporary, I would love to talk a little bit about the gray swords. We gain the gray swords momentum in Memories of Ice, where we see them sort of building up and embracing the worlds of war instead of Fenner, and then their sort of search for the Destriant and Shield and Mortal Sword. We get a lot of buildup from them, but then they are sort of decimated off screen. This question, this was something I was pontificating about, but thinking about, and Surov from Discord said, was it always the plan to end them this way, off screen, without more development, or did you have plans for them which changed later and could no longer fit the story?
Um, Geez, I kind of remember. Uh, they do play a role, at least a subset of them will play a role in books 9 and 10. I think kind of what happened with the Gray Swords was um, I knew that they were part of some of the early gaming map making stuff that was going on. So I created a people called the Parish on a particular coastline, and I guess I probably had a couple of pages of notes on them. What culture, what they were going to be like, and then in Memories of Ice, when I finally sort of had the opportunity to put them into the novels, when they arrived, curiously, they arrived with this interesting diction level, and rhythm of speaking, which was actually really quite interesting. So I guess I probably just didn't want to let go of them um, because they are interesting. And then it was then a question of, well, okay, can I take their belief systems and sew them into the greater storyline? And that's where the whole Fenner thing came to the fore. And then, of course, Fenner is pulled into into the mortal realm. So um, there has to be some kind of continuation of that role with the Gray Swords. But I also knew, I mean, with Memories of Ice, I killed off, kind of the major ones. So, yeah. So I mean, you're looking now at the Gray Helms, right? I think that's what they are by this
Oh,
point.
yes.
Yeah, and it's just it's another iteration of the same, emerging from the same culture and the same civilization.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about the conversion moment at the end of the novel. Lana and I both absolutely loved it, and particularly how it's articulated with the different POV changes as Silchus and the team are kind of coming through the portal, and we get Saren's POV, and she doesn't quite see Troll, but she sees someone there. Like the switching of POVs in that sequence creates such anticipation and drives that moment forward with such a rabid pace. But we also noticed that we don't ever really get back to Kettle's POV, even though it feels like she has been aware of her own sacrifice, the necessity of her own sacrifice from early on. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe the reason why we don't return to Kettle in particular and check in with her as all that is happening?
It may have been one point of view too many in terms of putting together that sequence, because it's quite rapid, right? What happens?
Yeah.
It's explosive.
Yeah.
And if you try to throw into, I guess, too many points of view, you're breaking up the pace and the rhythm of that. But also, I think I didn't want to repeat myself in the sense of having the reader too close to Kettle by that point. So there was a process each time I went to that scene before I was leading up to that climactic clash. I was disengaging from Kettle slowly, so that when it occurs, you don't necessarily have this huge emotional connection with Kettle, because by that point, her function is quite simply symbolic. That's what she's been a walking metaphor all the way through this for the rebirth or the birth of it in the Zathos. So,
Yeah.
so that's one of those cases where if I hadn't have done that, if we gone on, say, the whole Beak direction with Kettle, the response for the reader would have been, in a sense, too emotional. And so, if it's too emotional in terms of, say I'd stayed with Kettle and right up to the end, then there's almost no room for understanding why all that had to take place, because the reader is too upset, potentially,
I think
on the death
that's
of Kettle. Does
so
that make sense?
interesting. It does, but what I
Yeah.
think is interesting about it is I feel like from my perspective, as I was reading through and we got further and further from Kettle, the easier it was to only perceive her as a little girl who's sort of along for the journey. But it felt like she was self-aware of like, oh, I'm going to be in his house. And if I felt like if I were in her brain, she would have been like, yeah, I'm going to be a treehouse. And she would have
Right.
like known. And so I almost feel like the extreme protection that Udanas and Saren are trying to have over her to stop this from happening. And then when it does happen, it almost feels like, oh, that's what she's fulfilling the thing that she was born again to do in a way. And so the distance almost made me feel more for her because it was much easier to perceive her as just a little girl. And I guess it did make it feel less sad because I was like, oh, she must have known. But maybe there was like a less brutal way. She could have just like planted herself in some way.
Just putting dirt over me.
Like a lizard in the desert.
Well, except that group was a gnarly bunch, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And, the grumpy group.
Yeah, they're sniping at each other all the way through. I really enjoyed writing that because all too often, especially in gaming, you get your adventure party and everybody likes each other.
Right.
Although I will say that I have actually run groups where players have played characters who did not like each other, and that's a lot of fun too. But there is that kind of almost cliche, we're all in this together, rah kind of thing.
Right.
And so here I was going to have this quest group that was just all over each other. There's just it was not a happy group of campers, and that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Because then you can have that clashing points of view, especially Udanas and Fear, for example.
Yeah. Oh, man.
I love that group.
So many great scenes.
So many great scenes. And I specifically would love to ask you about Clip. Did you have some teenage jerk that you recall that you're side-eyeing with this characterization? Or are you just like embracing like who would be the worst traveling buddy? Some emo egotistical teenager who's like thinks they're hot stuff but is kind of a chump.
I don't know. Probably every fight I ever met is probably wrapped up in that one. But great fun to write. Yeah, great fun to write. Clip was and Yeah, I mean, you're going to see more of them, so I won't say too much, but yeah, absolutely a lot of fun to write.
I
And
heard.
I remember, I guess it was spontaneous that I just wanted something, a habitual gesture that was going to be really irritating,
Mm.
right? And so then, that notion of the chain that he would spin, just, yeah, I figured, okay, that's the one. That's the one I'll use for them.
I went to high school with a guy like Clip for sure. Where you're like, you think
Yeah,
this is an attribute that's making you look cool and mysterious,
yeah,
but you gotta stop.
yep.
Turned out he was an assassin. No, I heard you mention that same thing on our friends over the 10 Very Big Books podcast when you had talked about this novel. They had asked you, how do you make someone annoying? And you had mentioned, give them a something that they do all over and over again.
Oh, Terralac Mead, yeah.
Yeah, with the thing,
Yeah.
it's so good.
Ugh.
So I'm watching with my wife, and I have been binge watching a show on Apple TV Plus called Bad Sisters. I don't know if
Hmm.
either of you have seen it,
Mm-mm.
but it's basically about these sisters that decide they have to murder one of the sisters' husbands because he's such a jerk, and the show gives him this this nose spray that he's constantly doing, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, that's it, that's exactly what Steven Erikson said. Like, give them an annoying, and you immediately hate him because he's always going, it's like,
Yep.
I was like, yes, it's it
Yeah.
works, it always works.
It does work. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Ugh.
Anyway, that was a long way to go to tell you you're right. Another thing that I love that is a observation that comes at the end of Reaper's Gale is Tejal's observation that a sense of humor is a
Mm.
tell for whether someone is going to be a monster or not.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could comment on that. Is it just, it seems obvious when you point it out, but it's not something that I thought of before I read it in your novel.
Hmm. Um, I don't know. It's just, I guess, a life observation,
Yeah.
as I've gone through the years. Um, I mean, we're seeing it now. There's either the Daily Show and stuff like that. I mean, it's the comedians are they're getting to the absurdity of things. And I mean, that's part of their function, right? They are that warped mirror to our society, to ourselves. And yeah, you either laugh or you cry, right? So um, I yeah, I mean, Tahol and Bug are sort of engaged in um, an ongoing sitcom, as far as
Right.
any reader is concerned.
Me and my elder god.
Yeah,
Dun, 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 dun,
exactly.
dun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So humor is clearly, their primary coping mechanism, but also it's efficacious for them because it allows them to survive in this situation, in this culture, the civilization. So I guess, yeah, it's more. I don't know if it's entirely true, but it seemed like a decent thesis to hold, to propound, upon, especially against Karos and Big Dad and the other ones, because um, it's not really much different from those instances of um, satire and comedy that we see, say Mel Brooks and the History of the
Yeah.
World, or Faulty Towers, and Don't Mention the War, and all that kind of stuff, with
Mhm.
John Cleese. So, and it's that kind of humor that I think it's much needed. And the more stressful our times get, I think the more we need to look to that for our strength.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the inverse is also true, as Teal points out, which is like the more obsessed with money you are, the less funny you tend to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But that, I mean, that's quite understandable. it's stress, and you would think in the absence of financial pressure that stress would go away, but it doesn't. It's just it moves on to another target, if you will.
Mm.
So that's again, I guess it's just a human condition. It's we fear instability, and so we do everything we can to sort of um, bolster up. Um, and yeah, obviously that can occur to excess,
Mm.
as we see these days. But
Mhm. One of the things I loved about Tejal's humor is when Tejal himself finally gets serious in that one glimpse, because
mhm,
then he immediately goes back to, I don't want to say coping, but like persevering and showing the consistent resilience through the levity that he tries to bring through everything, even when he's being literally beaten to a pulp. Uh, I When you're watching the downfall of Letheras through Tehol and Bugs, like, we're making some shoe insole soup and we're so cute, we burned everything in the house, like whatever their little uh sitcom-y moments are, it really feels like, yeah, get a woo, and then they're like riding in the streets, you're like, Tehol did that, and it really feels like you cheer along with them. And in the moment that he is talking, before he gets captured by the patriotists, it sort of strips away and he dips into that seriousness and just sort of delivers this honest and climactic, uh I can't my words are not coming to me today, but spiel about what he's been on to, kind of, and sort of his
mhm,
perspective on things. And that moment feels, especially because we know Bug is trapped elsewhere, it feels so heavy when he,
mm,
when his humor is stripped away. It is such a powerful moment for that one glimpse. And when he finally says, "You really should have left," I felt the weight of those words from him specifically. Very, it suddenly is like, oh yeah, everything that's happening is dark and is scary, and you
mm,
notice it so much more. I mean, you notice it the whole time through the various POVs, but Tehal being so beloved as reading along with his journey, uh, there's no question here. Just the comedy. I'm like trying to get to a question, and I'm just like, the comedy and the use of it, and then the absence of it for that moment really felt like such a powerful turn.
there had to be a point where you pull aside the veil, and so I knew at some point I couldn't. It wouldn't be enough to just continue on that surface level of because if I had done that, then in a sense the the fallout of what they were engaged in would be far more monstrous. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
so people are left destitute and lives are lost. So yeah, if I just stayed on that comedic level, that would be um, I guess monstrous is the only word. Uh, there's a podcast commentator who uses the name Ruth and Bad,
Mm.
and he does one does analysis of various things in the Malazan stuff, and he does one where his thesis is basically that the most diabolical and monstrous character of the entire series is Tehol.
Oh, really?
It's worth listening to. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
was oh, go ahead.
there's
Sorry.
elements of that. There's certainly elements of that. Um,
He
but I
he
think,
certainly makes cold calculation, right? He
yeah,
certainly decides we're going to make an omelet, but we're going to have to break some eggs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Knowing that you have to pull aside that veil for, like, yeah, he really does know what he's doing here. It's not like he's like having a fun time. He
Hmm.
knows the damage that he is causing, and it is calculated and intentional. The choice to only pull aside that veil for that one scene and then pull it right back again from him being like, cool little bug toy, I wonder who made it. Did you, was it the glimpse, an intentional peek behind the curtain,
Hmm.
and then getting right back into what we
Yep.
knew? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and it had to be sort of succinct enough that it could fill up all that space behind that veil.
Yeah.
Because if I were to do it piecemeal, that would start belaboring the thing, and that would have a knock-on effect to when you go back to the comedic stuff, you're not buying it as much. I think I could be wrong, but yeah.
Yeah.
So of course we have to talk about Beak, because Beak, is certainly one of the most cherished moments of this novel. His backstory, his progression, that ultimate payoff, incredible. You saw what it did to both of us on the show, which is nothing compared to what it did to me when I was actually reading it. And you wrote eloquently in our comments section on the YouTube page about the sense of balance in him, which is so beautiful. I also loved two other aspects of the Beak storyline that I don't think we mentioned enough on our show. The first is that Hood's Gate looks differently to everyone who sees it, which I think is incredible, and I'd love you to talk about that. And the second is that Beak's unveiling of all his candles and the unleashing of all that magic doesn't just save the soldiers, it reveals them. And it doesn't just reveal them to Beak, it reveals them to each other, which I found so beautiful and such a powerful notion. And I wonder if you can discuss those two in particular, those two aspects.
Right. Let me think about that. So I had a sense that the consequences of all those candles lit would have to have some kind of physical manifestation. I don't know how. It's more a case of all of those other soldiers, with a few exceptions, knew very little about Beak. So they didn't have a direct relationship with him. And so this is just one of their soldiers then doing something extraordinary. And so the choice would be, if I didn't have anything sort of happen to each and every one of them, or to have sort of a visible consequence, all the bleaching and all the rest, then I would probably have to move into a whole slew of personal points of view to various soldiers as they all think about Beak, and the fact that they didn't know Beak, and that I think would have really kind of unplugged the reader's emotional engagement with that. I think we simply needed to see, rather than to go into the heads of all these other characters. We could go into the heads of the relevant ones, the ones who knew Beak. But this was a much more, I guess, elegant way to show that his presence affected everyone, regardless of whether they knew him or not. And so they were all then going to have to sort of come to terms with that change. And especially if you have a character like Hellion, who's is locked into her own kind of spiral that there's no emerging from. So to be delivered a reset the way she was, which has actually ultimately no effect on her behavior whatsoever. Right? So that was sort of kind of one sense of, if there's if you are changed in some way by somebody you don't know anything about, how do you deal with that? And it's going to be different for everybody. But if the change is universal, then there's a sense of connectedness immediately as soon as people look at each other. Although, as I say, Hellion's convinced otherwise. But,
which is such a brilliant,
the great
such
prank.
a brilliant reaction. I mean, way for her to react. I just love. What? Are they pranking me right now?
So
Well, yeah, I guess also, I think if I didn't have Helene do that, um, that would start edging onto almost a kind of melodrama in a sense.
Mm,
mm,
yeah.
Because, uh, and that's one of the things I guess learned through writing for all these years. You as the writer, even though if you're delivering something of intense emotion, you have to be wary of following too deeply into it. And so if you can use a character that through their thoughts and their actions can pull you back um, from taking it all too seriously, it's a very useful thing to do.
yeah,
That's such a great. You don't conceive of it like that as you're reading it, but looking back, you can go, "Oh yeah," undercutting that for just a moment with
Yeah,
another character, it balances it, and
stabilizes.
yeah, yeah,
I
Yeah.
you're
think so.
absolutely right.
Yeah, and
Pulls
I
you
think
out of
you
that
and
schmaltzy thing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And you'll see that in good film and television as well. You'll get
Mm.
um, characters will um, take that. I think Guardians of the Galaxy did a really good job of
Mm.
Mm.
constantly undermining and undercutting the almost creating a meta commentary on the cliches of superhero films.
Right.
Quite nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So one of the
sorry,
things.
sorry. Let me
Oh,
just follow up on the Beak thing real quick, and
okay.
I just
Oh yeah.
one quick more question about the Beak thing. When you write a scene like Beak's backstory, are
Mm.
you emotionally ravaged like we
Oh,
are when
oh
we read
God,
it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, and I've always said this, if I'm not generally affected by it, why would I expect any reader to be?
Mm.
Mm,
I have to go through it before they do. Um, that to me, that's the only sort of litmus test for this kind of stuff. Because otherwise, it's not okay. Well, fiction is manipulation of emotions to the reader, um, and there's really no escaping that. But as a writer, you need to have your imagination capable of and prepared to manipulate yourself.
Hmm.
And so you manipulate yourself and your emotions to get to that sense of deep feeling prior to, or rather as a precursor, if you will, to any have the expectation of any reader um, getting to that point. So yeah, I have to go through it before you guys. Um, and if I'm not feeling it, then I won't do it because it's not working.
mm,
And that doesn't always work, but we all have different sort of thresholds, emotional thresholds, and um, nobody's no two people are the same in terms of what engages them at a certain point.
Hmm.
Um, but I think the storyline with Beak, um, I don't know where it came from, but I had that image of the boy on his knees trying to hold up his brother, and that, and so again, it was a case of okay, well, when do I deliver that? When does that come? Um, and I guess my instincts told me that I have to wait as long as possible.
mm,
I cannot deliver it too soon. Um, so we just have, as the reader, you're just experiencing Beak's point of view, and you're wondering at it, and you're sensing its hard limitations that were externally or internally imposed, um, and not knowing the reasons for it until the time was appropriate to bring that story out. And of course, I think probably when I did it, I thought Beak's storyline was going to end at that point. But then I realized, no, there's no way. I need to have Hood there, and I need that gate, um, and I needed to show that uh, the soul that comes to that gate gives shape to it and transforms it. Um, so in other words, it's the soul after dying that actually can either create for itself um, through the legacy of its life, whether it's arriving through the gates of hell or the gates of heaven.
Yeah.
And so, with uh, with that in mind, then I realized that okay, I can bring this around to um, that story of it doesn't explain Beak, but it contextualizes Beak. It tells you what his background is and what his history is, um, and his sense of, I guess, physical failure regarding his brother. And then to just, okay, now he has to return. He needs, basically, he needs to be able to revisit this, but without the physical constraints of the child.
Yeah. It's such a powerful notion because you've been using Hood's gate and Hood himself as this curse word, as as only a negative thing, right? Only this bad place that you go. Nobody wants to go through Hood's gate, and it's this awful place. And I think we've seen it once too, where it was a gnarled and terrifying, scary, nightmare realm
With
and
Quick Ben's face,
Yes.
right?
yeah,
The eyes
yeah,
blinking, yeah.
exactly, just hiding in there like
Eh.
yeah, uh, and then to wait that long and then see it as the pearly gates or this this beautiful place that you can arrive at. Man, it's such a wallop for me. I just anyway, beautiful.
So, yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this, you mentioned sort of tracking reader overall sadness levels and having to like pull them out, or not wanting anything to sort of dip into too sad. But do you sort of chart in the same way individual character sentiment? So one of the things interesting about Beak is we get to know him more like Ferreton Sort does, where you're like, I see the potential in you, you're cool, you're powerful, and even more so because we actually get to be in his head with him. But then like Fiddler was mean to Beak. And other people who typically I'm like on their side, baby, I'm on their team. They're like, get this idiot away from me. And it felt almost like seeing somebody who's nice to you or like a buddy of yours be mean to like a waiter, where you'd be like, whoa, this is putting you in
Yep.
a different light that I didn't expect.
Mm.
Hood was nicer to Beak than his fellow soldiers.
Mhm.
Were you like, these people are too much the heroes, I gotta knock them down a peg? Or is it just like humanizing and just showing the
It,
differences of that character connection?
yeah, it's the humanizing bit, but also the stress levels that they're all under. If you've created a character that you're going to run through a long narrative, um, if you don't um, if you don't mess with them, if you don't sort of put pressures on them and push them in unexpected directions. So in other words, if they are consistent throughout, um, to me that strikes me as not only unrealistic but uninteresting.
Mm.
Um, no, everybody needs to have their bad days. Everybody needs their bad moments, and the more stressful the circumstance, and bearing in mind, especially Fiddler, who's almost taken on this paternal role for the Bonehunters, but he doesn't know what Tavor is up to, and so his stress levels are through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So in those circumstances, impatience is a very uh, predictable response to things, and on the other side, there's a kind of there can be a social impatience, savants and other people. So I think that needed to be acknowledged as well.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not going to be a consistent or universal response to uh, to just people, who are different.
I think too few authors do that, frankly, and I think you see it not just with authors, but in any storytelling. I mean, I think of actors who are unwilling to play characters that are flawed or have a certain. I'm thinking of like The Rock, for example.
Especially Jason Statham.
Yeah, notoriously, has to have a certain standard, or they won't play the character, and it is so true that we as audience will relate more to a character when we see their flaws, when we have those moments of pressure and they react in ways that are not ideal. I think of Felicin, for example, from earlier in the series as a character that I absolutely love because of her persnicketyness and her sort of not ideal reactions to those pressures. But yeah, it's something that I wish more storytellers recognize that isn't something that pushes a reader away from your character. It's one that draws them to them. Or
Yeah,
can.
well, I mean, in terms of those actors, I can see their point. Because we can see the opposite having happened, right? Actors whose first major role is of the villain end up being the villain in multiple roles, right? They're pulled in that direction. So certainly visually, and in like that media, there's definitely a colonization of the brain that's occurring, and that's a powerful thing. Think of the impact of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the film version, the latest one. Well, not the latest, but yeah. Anyways,
Peter Jackson's.
Peter Jackson's.
Yeah.
And now, when you think of the characters of Gandalf and Frodo and all the rest, whose face, whose visage comes into your mind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can see that. There would be an aversion to taking on those particular roles. Although, certain sort of, I guess, Shakespearean actors or stage actors don't hesitate. Anthony Hopkins is he's taken on a multitude of roles and seems to be able to move from one to the next and take the audience with him.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, in a cultural sense, that one role he played, it stays in our head. It stays in our head.
Well, I mean, even within the confines of a single role, I just I like that you can show the nuance of, like you said, everybody has bad days, right? And you can be a hero, and you can be someone that the audience is rooting for or feels a kinship with, and still do things that are not perfect, right? You don't have to be this infallible paragon of virtue. There are these moments that actually draw us closer because of the fallibility of the protagonist.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. And yeah, I think in some ways, in fiction, anyways, if that hero character is too much identified as authorial wish fulfillment, then you start seeing that all too virtuous consistency that runs all the way through. Yeah.
Speaking of bad days, I would love to talk about Janath.
We mispronounced it on purpose. I'm sure it annoyed you, but
no, I'm fine. You guys,
Janath.
Janath.
She's our fave.
Really loved her. I mean, one of the most visceral and raw depictions of like this extreme, like unforced vulnerability and weakness, married with also one of the greatest depictions of personal strength and resilience in the series so far, in a way similar to how you have sort of portrayed the sort of power levels of one being by putting it next to another, quick pen versus bottle versus the aerosol. Was it important to display the abuse of Janath? So I even just said Janice, Janath so fully in order to sort of juxtapose the power of her personal fortitude.
Yeah, and it very much she had to defeat everything that was laid out in front of her. There could be no, coming in from stage left, and especially not a male figure, could not come in to do that at all. So yeah, it was her internal fortitude, her strength as a character, that had to be the deciding thing. And in many ways, I guess it was to partly demonstrate that physical superiority of strength and that kind of power ultimately is insufficient to actually enforcing unwanted changes, on a victim, on somebody who's intended to be a victim, but who through their internal landscape refuses that role. Mm-hmm. And so her storyline is very much refusing the role. And if that was going to be the case, then I had to sort of push the other side of it to an extreme. And of course, what's his name? Is it
Tanal
Yathvanar?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And of course, his personality is I mean, it's the absolute opposite of Janath's personality, and it's actually by far the weakest between the two. It is so weak that it needs this social structure built around it, this fascistic structure built around it, in order to, feel empowered in some sense. And of course, all of that is the illusion, right? It's the whole puzzle. That's the illusion. Once you sort of reach once the facade is sort of exposed as ultimately a delusion and an illusion, then it all falls apart.
Yeah.
And so there's a parallel in terms of what's going on between Tahol and Karos and Bigdad and Janath and Yathvanar.
Janath's story and sort of like her purpose, it felt very independent as a whole, where like we've got the overarching story of like the fall of what's happening with Letheras and all the other sort of pieces, but Janath's sort of like connection to that wider plot, she's clearly important to Tahol and that whole group of folks, and seems like she will be incredibly important sort of in a wider way in the future. But in the context of this story, it was feeling very much like her personal journey. I feel like there's a world where we just see this extreme abuse of Janath and be like, yeah, it just shows how Tanal is a bad person, and that's it. And it could end in her demise. But the twist of having her have this extreme catharsis, independent of anybody saving her and independent of the Patriot's ultimate demise, makes it so compelling and engaging and a powerful and memorable part of this story. Can you talk a little bit about the choice to make sure that she came out on top, where, like, instead of just using her to show how evil this person is? Did you always intend for her to be so triumphant? And when it comes to having it all be herself, then the tie-in to having Bug come in and have her magically healed. or like the memories ejected, versus someone like Saren Pedek, who was obligated to reconcile with her assault in order to become whole.
Yeah. And I don't know if I at some point concluded that what Janath went through um, was so extreme that without, sort of godly intervention, there may not be any coming back from it.
Mm-hmm.
At least not in the sense of her being capable um, of loving or of being close to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Because you push that far enough in terms of that level of abuse, and the mind has to protect itself, and so that's what it does. So I think without Bug, you're looking at a catatonic state probably as a consequence of that. So her initial purpose, and when you mention it, it seems like sort of a nested story within the bigger one, but quite self-contained. Was initially the recognition that for fascistic power or totalitarian power to actually succeed, it needs to target the intellectuals, it needs to target the academics, it needs to target the artists. And historically, this is what happens, right? It happened in Russia, it happened in the Czech Republic. It just happened
right now.
Yeah, it just. So, yeah, because those have to be targeted, because they potentially represent, a cogent threat to that sort of house of cards.
This is the Fauci thing, right? It's Fauci. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the initial idea, was that she was going to represent that sort of objective, independent academia, even though I understand, as having gone through academia, that there's nothing objective or independent about it. But anyway, that was kind of the role, sort of, in terms of the emergence of this new fascistic iteration of the Letheras empire, which actually derives directly from the capitalist underpinnings of the whole thing anyways. I don't think those two are very disconnected at all. But then, as you write that point of view, and the more I guess, immerse myself in it, I need to find strength for that character, for my own sanity. And so she just got stronger and stronger and stronger, and as she did, the sands under Yathanar's feet just started, basically drifting away and crumbling.
Yeah.
And that kind of shifting of the powers dynamic between the two is certainly something. I don't know if I was planning it, but it became inevitable, and I could see that. So, generally when you, as a writer, when you start sort of, if you push into that place far enough, and I think I mentioned this before, but there's a sense of inevitability, and you just have to follow that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I love it.
Go ahead, Lana.
No, I just saying I love it.
I'll let the last question come from our audience. This was posted on our Discord by Peter XXX, who says, in the Malazan world, it seems all power seems to come with some sort of drawback. All the most powerful mages in this book have some sort of trauma to overcome. And even with some of the other characters, there seems to be very distinct personality traits the more powerful you are. I know that there are RPG systems where you can buy hindrances that would make things harder for your character to function in exchange for more building points. Is this where this originated, or is there a different reason?
Probably to begin with, yeah. The GURP system is one that has advantages and disadvantages. You buy your points back. Um, it's not the most comprehensive list of disadvantages, but if you can come up with a new one, and if the game master is happy with that, that's cool. So that was certainly part of the gaming, but I think it's more a case of again, one needs to balance these things. So um, you're about to sort of revisit a character who's immensely powerful, um, but also bears a correspondingly immense burden. And so, um, to me, that's just more intrinsically interesting in terms of it adds a new layer to that character. But it also gives the reader something to hang on and recognize, because regardless of how powerful the character is, whether they're human or draconic or godly or whatever, it's really all about the human condition, anyways. So that has to sort of manifest in all aspects of and at least characters where I'm getting close to their point of view or I'm using their point of view. Um, Bug is a curious. It's interesting because I've just finished. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I'm doing right now. I was doing the uh, Witness trilogy, and the second book of the Witness trilogies ended up becoming two books.
Mm.
But Bug has an appearance, and he's not a nice guy. He's not nice, and so that's fun because that, to me, that makes him a much more interesting and nuanced character. That, uh, yeah, it a lot depends on how you're approaching that character, and so to me, that's kind of what I'm always looking for. Is I'm always looking for something in terms of characters, that you can see as many facets to as possible, just so that they become more interesting that way. And unpredictable. Um, so consistently unpredictable, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it isn't actually.
No, it
It's
isn't.
the
Yeah.
human condition. I mean,
That's
that's what we
how
all are. We
I
are
would
all
describe
consistent.
this series of books as consistently unpredictable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I
It
would
In the
say
feels
best
we're all.
possible
full,
way.
I would say,
enriched.
yeah, I would say personality-wise, we're all like that. We're all
Mm,
consistently unpredictable.
mm.
So, um, and we're full of inherent contradictions. And for me, as I've aged, I've become much more comfortable with the notion of having inherent contradictions.
Mm.
It
Mm.
doesn't bother me anymore.
That's cool. Uh, you mentioned Bug not being a nice guy. It does seem to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem to me like the perspective of the Malazan series that being a nice guy and being a god is kind of mutually exclusive. It's not. It's once you attain a certain level of power, you kind of incapable of I don't know. It
You're
seems
mean
to.
to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, this novel we have the
Mm.
errant, and his
Oh, the
perspective.
errant, yeah.
He's a jerk, right?
There's
Hmm.
And
so much. Go ahead.
everybody. It seems like everybody who gets to a certain power level. I mean, even you see it. I think directly with Shadow Throne, like ascending to godhood, they become jerks. Like, you don't understand my plots. You don't
Hmm.
understand my machinations. You puny mortals. It seems like maybe that's kind of part and parcel with achieving that level of power, is that you kind of disassociate from your literal humanity.
Yeah, and I mean, we see that in our world.
Yes,
The
yes.
wealthiest really cannot connect with everybody else
Yeah.
because
Hmm.
the distance has grown too vast, and the requirements and the needs and the pressures are they're just completely um,
Hmm.
unfathomable. Um,
And even in the case of the gods that you mentioned, like or is it the very beginning of this book, Time Has Lost Meaning, where there were gods? Was it this book? Last book? There were gods who decided to kill all their followers because the things that their followers were demanding were too sinister. Like the
Oh yeah, well, no,
evilness
that's
inherent is
yeah.
also in serving people who may be like being pulled in a million different directions that might not always have honorable intentions or always damaging to someone.
The temple that Helion discovers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Banishar and
Yeah.
but I mean that's a sort of different. Well, not different, but it's another thematic exploration that's going on. Is the nature of religion, organized and otherwise. It's just something I've always had sort of an abiding interest in. I have no solutions. I have no conclusions.
No. Tell
just
us the answer,
space,
please.
yeah.
Okay, well, on the one hand, think of Cotillion, and that is very much the thing he is struggling with, right?
Yeah.
And he has moved into godhood.
Right.
He's reluctant or he's resisting the loss of his humanity.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Yeah. The use of gods in this series is infinitely fascinating to me, and the relationship with their followers, and that it's a two-way street, and all of those insights I think are just so fascinating to me. I love that aspect of the series so very much, and excited to see more because I know we're headed toward a showdown with gods.
Yeah.
So.
I cannot believe how many things, even just about this book, that we didn't even touch on. The errant, the shake,
I know. Yeah.
There's like so many pieces, and it just, you've well explored the space, and it feels luxurious too.
Well, plenty of the shake is yet to come. They became favorites of mine. And sometimes it just happens, right? And you don't plan it. I mean, I have everything I had everything worked out in terms of where it was going to end up. But I left plenty of room for things to just emerge spontaneously that would become interesting. And that's the fun part, as the writer. If you map out too much, you've taken your own enjoyment out of the process. You need that room for invention on the fly, as it were.
Do those two things ever come into tension, where you have something fun that's happening that invalidates some plan that you have, and you've got to figure out what to do?
Not invalidate, but complicate. Which then, at that point, I have to sort of figure out a way to sew that whole storyline thematically and plot-wise into the overall story. And I think that was the case with the Shake. They just sort of took off on me, and then I realized, especially when I know we're running long here. Sorry about that, but
no, it's okay. We love it. But
okay, especially when Yed and Derek shows up, Twilight's brother. That character, when he just showed up, it was just like, holy shit. He just became so interesting, and I mean, there's so much more to come with him. So that kind of stuff to me is my reward as I'm writing, is just to have something like that arrive. And I'm happy to say it still happens to this day. When I'm working on even the Malazan stuff, a character will just arrive and they have very small appearance, and then I realize, no, I can't leave this character alone. But I mean, the examples in Reaper's Gale would be Old Hunch Arbat. Right? Just popped in briefly, but something about the name really intrigued me. And the fact
and his job, which is fascinating job.
And then so I guess in a sense, you just sort of put a little gold star beside, a character that or something that you want to come back to and that's fun as well. Because
I can
sometimes I don't know who that, am I going to come back to that character or not? But there's something there that yeah, I want to revisit.
I cannot tell you how pleased I was to see Ersto Hubutt back again.
Well, yeah, it's funny because quite often it's two names together that actually have the real impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why that is, but maybe because of classic comedy teams or whatever. But
Right.
Ersto Hubutt and Pinocel
They're great. I
they
love
just,
them.
yeah.
Oh, you're right. Ersto Hubutt and Pinocel. It does sound like an old comedy duo.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, George Burns and Gracie,
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. We absolutely love talking with you and love going through these novels. I can't believe we're already on book 8.
And you're heading to, I think, the three of the longest. So it's going to be a while before we talk again. Unless you want to, stop at the halfway point or whatever and chat.
Oh.
I'm happy to do that too.
Oh, fun. Well,
it's a big book, the one that's coming.
Okay. Everybody is very excited for us to start this one. So I am anticipating loving it. Cannot wait. You mentioned, just as we leave, finishing something. Are there anything you can report as to new things that we might be excited about?
Yeah, I've delivered. Remember I mentioned book 2 ended up becoming 2 books.
Mm-hmm.
So I've delivered them both. So they're done. I have a standalone novel that I have a little bit of revision still to do, but that one's way out in left field, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to find a publisher for it. But anyways,
is this that sci-fi thing? I heard you mention it.
No,
okay,
no, it's different.
Okay,
and it's not especially large, but it was an obsession of mine for a long time, and so that one's done as well, except for I think one scene I have to revise. And I don't know. I'll send it to my agent and see what happens. But if everything sort of fails in that direction, I might self-publish. I'm not sure.
Wow,
cool.
So, any of these potentially a 2025 release, or is that?
I don't know. Right now, I guess the second one, No Life Forsaken, in the Witness trilogy, is in the copy editing stage at the moment. So usually what happens is I wait months for that, and then it arrives and they say we want it next week, and so I have to kind of drop everything. But I'm writing.
Old hurry up and wait.
Yeah, I'm writing Walk in Shadow right now, and I was hoping to have it done by April or May. We'll have to see. I also got another 8,000 signing sheets that arrived in 9 boxes. So
wow.
I'm slowly working through those, and this time around, I'm starting to get a bit of tendonitis in the shoulder, shoulder, but there's plenty of hockey games to watch, so I just sit there and sign.
I don't want to compare myself to Mr. Steven Erikson, but I just did that too. I'm putting out. I have a book of limericks that I'm publishing.
Oh, cool!
And I had to do. I didn't sign nearly as many as you're talking about, but I can at least relate a little bit. I literally put them in the mail today. I sent them back today, this morning.
Yeah, I think the key is to come up with a public signature that is easy.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
The hand has to flow quite nicely, and the wrist has to be able to move with the signature.
Yeah. Not wrong about that. You realize, oh, my name is too long.
Oh, I mean, yeah, my co-creator of the Malazan stuff, Cam, Ian Eslamont. So Ian Eslamont, but also he's left-handed, so he's got to reverse the books. And
me too. I'm left-handed as
and
well.
It's like, I watch him do it, and I just wince.
The curse. It's a lifelong curse, left-handedness.
I bet it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Have you
Yeah.
ever considered signing your name in all caps like a child and not writing your last name? Because that's mine.
Oh, I don't write my last name. It's
Oh,
just
good
the
old
first name.
Lana B.
That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
just do the first name. But yeah, it's yeah. If I were to do the full name, it would take me way too long because I'd have to invent Erikson as
Yeah.
a signature.
Yeah.
'Cause
Right. Because it's not your
it's
signature.
not mine. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good
So,
point. Yeah.
but if I just do Steve, it fits for both, so it's okay.
I just saw a video. Do you know Hank and John Green? They're anyway. John Green just had a video where he literally was told by a doctor that he can no longer sign those things because he had done so many of them that he literally got a problem with his arm.
Yeah,
So he can't do it anymore.
Yeah,
Oh my
I can
God.
see that. I can see that repetitive strain.
Yeah.
I think Margaret Atwood certainly was running into that and creating, she got her signature machine or whatever it was,
Signature
mechanical machine. And then other people talked about, why don't you just get a stamp? But these are special edition of the book, and so a stamp just
It's not what
it
people
doesn't
want.
fly.
They want your pain. That's
want
what
my pain,
That's what they're paying for. That's very exciting that there are more novels coming, hopefully soon. And again, we're so excited. Thank you for being here. As always, we appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you guys for watching. I think we're going to take next week off, and then we will be back with the first chapters of Toll the Hounds. So stay right here for that. Subscribe. We'll see you very soon.